Good evening. I'm told we're going to get started, so I'd like to welcome all of you here this evening. My name is Michael Timko. I'm a faculty member in the biology department at the University of Virginia, and I'm also in charge of the University of Virginia Industrial Hemp and Medical Cannabis Research Program. So this is a very apropos panel for me to host this evening. And so with that, I'd like to end all the public service announcements and get on to the gist of today's program. And what we're going to be talking about is growing hemp in Virginia then and now. And it's my sincere pleasure to welcome this evening's guests and panelists, Dr. Emily Dufton, the author of Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America, and Doug Fine, the author of Hemp Bound, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Next Agricultural Revolution. Emily and Doug are here, of course, to share with you their works and to discuss the history of cannabis, hemp, marijuana, however you want to refer to it, the legal struggles that have been associated with the plant, and the fine aspects of growing the plant and why its use industrially and recreationally is a flashpoint. So many of you already know that hemp is a crop that was essential to the founding of this great nation. Since we are in Charlottesville, we always have to point out that our founder, Thomas Jefferson, was a big proponent of hemp and actually invented the hemp rake, which at the time was the way in which hemp breading was done on all of the local farms. And so thank you again, Mr. Jefferson, for all you do. Let me begin by introducing our panelists and give you a little bit of their background, and I'll turn it over to them to carry on the rest of the discussion. First off, Emily Dutton is a writer and a historian based nearby here in Washington, D.C. She received her Ph.D. in American Studies at George Washington University, where her doctoral dissertation was entitled Just Say No, K-N-O-W, How the Parents Movement Shaped the War on Drugs, 1970 to 2000. Her dissertation was aimed at examining the intersection of the activist movement for drug reform and the state and federal war on drugs that was being carried out throughout that time. Her dissertation framed the arguments between whether legalization in the context of legal liberal reform was really the lens by which people should be looking at the question, and how the parents' movements and parents' groups that were really looking at let's protect our kids type of legislation kind of derailed the movement going forward. Grassroots is her first book. It's based off her dissertation, and she has a second book currently in the research phase that will cover the methamphetamine and opioid epidemic currently embracing the U.S. She, more than most people, understands the opposition to drug reform and the battle that many seasoned veterans have been fighting for the repeal and replace movement, and says drug prohibitionists will not go away without putting up a fight. So she'll talk about that interface. Our other panelist is Doug Fine, who is an American author, journalist, humorist, hemp farmer, entrepreneur, and solar-powered goat herder, which I thought was an interesting comment. He began his career as a freelance journalist. He worked for organizations such as the Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, Sierra, Wired, and the National Public Radio. And he has written several books, including Not Really an Alaskan Mountain Man, Farewell My Subaru, Too High to Fail, Cannabis and the New Green Economic Revolution. And, of course, Hemp Bound, the dispatches from the front lines of the next agricultural revolution, which that well-known singer and cannabis activist Willie Nelson calls a blueprint for America of the future. So most recently, Doug has also penned the First Legal Harvest, which was printed on hemp paper, and Doug is heavily involved in the development of seed for growing in the U.S. He's working with the University of Hawaii, among other people, and is the lead consultant for the first federally permitted Native American Hemp Project directed by the Colesville Indian Tribe in Washington. And with that, I'm going to stop speaking and I'm going to ask Doug to tell you a little bit about his story and what aspects of hemp has excited him over the last decades of his work. Doug?
Thank you so much. Professor Michael Timko is my first thanks before I leap in. He is the ideal person to moderate this panel because of having active work in hemp underway in Virginia right now. And so I thank you so much for bringing your knowledge here and for moderating this panel. It's an honor to be here alongside Emily as well. My brother, by the way, works at the George Washington University as a surgeon. So I'm glad that we got to cross paths. A few other brief thanks. Besides the festival, so many people for bringing me here. I really do so appreciate it. And the Virginia Industrial Hemp Coalition, and my good friend Jason Amatucci, who's here doing great work in Virginia. He gave me bent my ear on the latest that there may be exciting news coming from the governor's desk on finally expanding hemp here. He's been, and others have been diligently working on it, and we have him to thank for Thomas Jefferson ceasing to roll over in his grave with hemp coming back, and also thank you for the organization for sponsoring the panel. So I'm going through the grind, the ringer. This is real. This is happening. I've got active hemp projects that I'm involved in, entrepreneurial hemp product. As Professor Timko mentioned, I'm consulting for a Native American group and seed developing in the University of Hawaii, and it goes on and on. In fact, we have a minor connection already before we met in person, is that some cultivars that I helped develop are involved in some of the educational work going on through his work, including in soil healing. So that's very exciting to me as someone who wants to have a healthy planet for my own children, my human and goat children. He was kind enough to mention that I am a goat herder. And my theme today, that's our all of our goats on the Funky Butte Ranch in New Mexico in my home are named after singers. So this is Julie Andrews, just born now 3 weeks ago. And connecting the dots is the theme of what I'm going to kind of go through here a little bit today, just for 10 or 15 minutes. And then, of course, after Emily gives her presentation, we can take questions, or I'm sure Professor Timko might have some comments. But when I say connecting the dots, the lesson of hemp for me has been an introduction to the fact that we must have a regenerative economy if humanity is to survive. We have to make the choice. Do we want to use the same models that we've used in not just our agricultural pipeline, but our entire industrial pipeline for the last century and a half, or which is namely a very few very few large producers and farmers not really being independent. We're down to 1% of Americans being farmers, 90% in Thomas Jefferson's day, and 30% when cannabis prohibition started. Or do we want to re-establish independent agriculture and a wider industrial pipeline, recreate lucrative rural communities? And that's what I'm dedicated to seeing hemp happening. And just to give you a few examples, I'll go through the different projects and show how this regenerative entrepreneurial mindset is playing out. But in our Hawaii project, that's my colleague Melody Heidel with the University of Hawaii there, we drove in her electric car, that's our seed, on the way to the field to plant. And I wanted to take this picture as an example of what I mean by connecting the dots, that we were attempting to churn as minimal amount of petroleum even in planting our field. I'll quickly run through a few other applications. My sweetheart, whom I adore, makes a lot of hemp clothing for us on the ranch. So I'm clad today in hemp corduroy vest she made and a hemp shirt that she made. This made by my friends at Colorado Hemp Company. This hemp printed example of the Thomas Jefferson Declaration of Independence. Got a couple of them for sale, folks. Afterwards. I'm trying to show as a model, a group that I've been working with in Vermont for a couple of years. We developed a farm-to-table hemp product, which is the hemp seed oil pressed and infused with the flour from the same plant on the farm. We even harvested with combines running on biofuel. Not yet hemp-pressed biofuel because the oil was too precious, but at least it was sunflower oil. Point being, trying to connect the dots. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. We'll get into next generation applications here in a little while, I feel like I'm on a speed dating situation here with a limited amount of time. But this is 3D printed, US grown hemp fiber made into plastic on this pen by a great group called Green Spring Technology in Texas, run by a couple of veterans. And we're moving to reduce the Pacific garbage patch, a big issue in Hawaii. Now, so all of these are wonderful ideas, concepts, and dreams. How do we implement them in the reality of the real world marketplace and industrial architecture? I'll tell you, it's happening. Even with some restrictions still remaining on the U.S. hemp industry, it's growing by double digits. The U.S. hemp industry returned officially in the 2014 Federal Farm Bill, which allowed research for hemp, as long as there's a state program. And it's up to the state to decide how robust this program is going to be. I am working in states that are extremely robust, like Vermont, and states that are extremely hesitant, like Washington and Hawaii, as we'll see. And they're all going to get there because the industry is too important to farmers and too valuable to mitigating climate change by sequestering carbon in the soil. But I always like to ask, show of hands, DEA agents here today? Show of hands, DEA agents in the crowd. Welcome, as always. You guys are doing a great job. I'm a patriot and a father and a law-abiding citizen, and I really urge you to keep up the great work and get the heck out of the cannabis hemp sphere, because there's real problems, as Emily is covering in her next book. Opiates and methamphetamine and cannabis hemp are good. They are good for our public safety, they're good for our families, they're good for our economy. And any other explanation makes Thomas Jefferson roll over in his grave, which we wouldn't want to do. Thanks also to Betsy Ross for her original hemp flag, Levi Strauss for their original hemp jeans. These are obviously not originals, but they are hemp. So if I'm getting one message again across to potential hemp farmers today, it is your work doesn't end with the harvest, it's just starting. I want to acknowledge two of my closest friends. They get embarrassed when I call them mentors, but they are from Natural Good Medicines and Winter Fox Farms in Oregon, Edgar Winters and Margaret Florlin, if you guys wouldn't mind raising your hand there. These guys I call them my hemp professors. I'm filming them for a television show I'm doing about hemp. They are great, terrific, extremely knowledgeable people. And Margaret has a slogan, she just says, after harvest. She'll just start talking to you, start it right at harvest, and she'll tell you all the work, because she makes these fantastic value-added products along these lines. But check out the Natural Good Medicines line in Oregon, they're fantastic. So my point is, I have learned the hard way that you need to communicate with your collaborators that you are not just harvesting a commodity. That's how farmers, excuse my French, get screwed. You are here to market a product that is going to create regenerative value for your communities in the long run. The end game, if I have anything to do with it, is not selling out your entity to some hedge fund. The end game is creating a lucrative future for your community. I'm sure most folks here have heard about the accelerator effect. That's where every dollar that you keep in the economy as it climbs up the economic chain magnifies exponentially the revenue that is generated locally. And so we can revive rural America in the digital age. Can you believe it? Not just through this plant, but through many plants in our coming bio-based economy. I tried to find the most complicated picture that I could find on the internet to explain how many things there are to think about. This is just briefly my last week working in the hemp industry, not counting phone calls with Hawaii and looking at pictures to make sure that the hemp crop's looking good that we're going to harvest in a few weeks. This is just physically where I've been, okay? I left my Funky Butte ranch in New Mexico, went to Denver, met my colleagues, drove with seed thousands of miles, helped distribute that seed, detoured up to Vermont, trudged through the snow. I can tell my kids, the worst part about it wasn't the trudging the snow, it was not renting the right size rental car. Edgar tried to warn me, get the SUV, and I got the Mazda, and I'm bottoming out in this backcountry Vermont in the middle of an unexpected equinox snowstorm, and picking up and cleaning 1,000 pounds of bagging 1,000 pounds of seed, because farmers need the seed, and then coming down here to speak to you good folks, and it goes on from there. On the Colville Tribes project, we're up to packaging and marketing our 60-acre hemp harvest last year. I think I got a Colville slide here somewhere. That was the council coming out to bless the crop, and the crop took off after the blessing, so I was asking no questions. Washington's got a terrible hemp law, and let me phrase that more positively. Washington is moving toward the same kind of robust hemp law that we expect to see in very proactive hemp states like New York, Oregon, and it sounds from speaking to Jason like Virginia as well. But we were restricted to imported, again, excuse the French, crappy cultivars last year that the farmers weren't allowed to replant. That is serfdom. I ain't into it. I'm not going to, it's kind of from my, whatever the gun guys say, of prying from your dying fingers. From my dying fingers, will I allow this plant to become another, well, I won't use the M word, another big ag restricted plant that rips off farmers. That's not going to happen, and there's millions of farmers out there who feel like I do. So the Colville tribe, despite the restrictions, grew a great crop, doubling acres this year, and in the connecting the dots category, we're looking now into regenerative packaging, eventually coming from the fiber from the crop, but for the first year, things like recycled paper and that kind of business, so that it conveys the seventh generation mentality message that people associate with tribal products. Got about 5 more minutes here. Is there anybody here who has not heard of the endocannabinoid system? Show of hands. Okay, so you are lucky. Everyone here has a built-in system that I think of as sort of like Velcro that is throughout your system. There's 2 parts to it. We won't get into the details today, but I urge folks to do more research on it. Basically, when you injure your leg, or God forbid if your kidneys inflame, your receptors go up. Your endocannabinoid receptors go up, waiting for cannabinoids to be introduced to your body. We've co-evolved with this plant. Michael Pollan writes about it in his book, The Botany of Desire. It's good for the plant, it's good for people. The plant continues to have its DNA furthered, and we have everything from great clothing to great health maintenance, nutritive from the seed oil to, I avoid the word medicinal because that's a special category in our modern lab coat age, but to products that have been recognized as important, let's say, in Chinese medicine for 12,000 years. This is one of humanity's longest utilized plants. So the endocannabinoid system is your built-in system that receives the cannabinoids and reduces the pain, reduces the inflammation, whatever it may be. Everybody's body's different. Not everything works for everybody, but I have seen certain types of epilepsy in children stopped with cannabinoids, which are the components in the hemp plant, of which THC is the most famous. That's why we have Woodstock. CBD is non-psychoactive pain reduction, and very popular right now, but it goes way beyond that. We're getting really good feedback on relaxation from people who use this topically, and why? We think it's the CBC, another cannabinoid among the 40 to 80 known cannabinoids now, and the associated bioflavonoids, terpenes. This is real science, and it's also holistic plant medicine that, as we discussed, some cultures have recognized for millennia. Part of this connecting the dots is understanding that your cheapest eggs, let's say, are not the ones with the lowest price tag from the factory farming in your supermarket, but the ones that your own chickens lay, or your friends at the farmers market, CSAs provide you, or that you get at your local food co-op. As you know, this is what you're looking for: is healthy food that provides real nutrition. Bioavailability is a term I urge folks to stick with and look into a little bit. This was actually a hemp-printed 3D goat from that Vermont crop in the background. I was really proud of that one. And I told you we ran the combine on biofuel there. You see in the center picture. Okay, so briefly, we talked a little about regenerativeness. In Hawaii, it's about rebuilding soil from a century and a half of sugarcane monoculture and starting to grow traditional Hawaii canoe foods, the crops that the Polynesians brought over, navigating by the stars. They thought it was important enough to have these in their canoes, and now they're starting to grow them again, as in this picture there. That's kalo, a sacred and very healthy root plant. Here's something I really want to talk about when we get into value-added marketing. Your products are going to be unique to what you do and what you are. This obviously maple syrupy, this says Vermont, Ben and Jerry's kind of feel, right? In Hawaii, it's going to be the hula and the ukulele. In Virginia, I'm guessing it's going to be Thomas Jefferson-y, whatever it is, whatever you got here that is unique and distinct. Get ready for value-added. Get ready for value-added marketing. It's going to be different and distinct in every place. Please don't think you're going to get rich on hemp in the first year. Are you going to get rich in the first year, Edgar, Margaret? I don't think so. No? Jason? No? Not rich yet? No, me neither. Damn it. We'll get there. Not that that's the end game, but we're having a lot of fun doing it, and we do feel like we're on a mission. We're here to save humanity alongside all of you all. Watch out about scaling up. Don't scale up too fast. I'm running out of my 15 minutes here. So, again, think vertically. Market your product as much as you can regionally and in your community. And the social engineering is the hardest. Dealing with colleagues and different expectations, make sure your communication is good. I've had some personnel changes in some of my products, and I've learned to better communicate with those around us. Briefly, why I got into hemp, 150,000 acre wildfire in my backyard. We're all experiencing this crazy climate change. Mike and I were talking before the panel about how the seasonal stuff isn't, as folks remember here, our monsoon season in New Mexico is completely screwy. Too much, too little, late, early. It's almost never right on time and almost never average. You can see the floods, the fires. The big fire was right in our backyard, scared a bear down, killed a bunch of our goats. It was very traumatic for the family, and that's when I became the sort of passionate guy about this plant that you hear about today. And with that, I think I will pass it on. Oh, this will be the last fun thing. This is my favorite hemp application. Hemp-based supercapacitors, okay? And I know Professor Timko knows about this. I may even be working on it. The study out of the American Chemical Society, David Mitlin now at Clarkson College started this research. It's one of these things where you sound like your roommate with the lava lamp saying hemp cures everything, hemp saves the world, hemp is the be-all end-all. This is really true. This is not Woodstock stuff. The fiber in hemp is showing at the nano level, having to do with the structure of the carbon atoms when hemp gets reduced to that single molecular level. Better energy, not storage, but better energy transfer, what the supercapacitors that are going to be charging our cars and our homes in the near future, ideally solar charged, that's real. That's happening. Keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll let the others take over and take any questions you may have.
Good. Thank you, Doug. We'll have questions for Doug after Emily makes her comments. So, Emily Dufton.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Doug. That was fascinating, completely amazing. I'm so happy to be here. This is my first book. It came out in December. I should start my timer so I know how much time I have. So my baby has been alive for about 3 months now. Very, very proud. It's my first big, author festival, and it was a real honor to be invited to be on this panel specifically. My book is about marijuana activism. I still use the term marijuana. I've read a couple of reports that suggest that it really doesn't have that deeply racist connection that some people argue that it does. In fact, it's actually a more native term for it. Cannabis, of course, being the term that was given by Carl Linnaeus, the 18th century Swedish biologist. So it's like, which term do you want to go for? I use them interchangeably. I hope that's okay. So I wrote the history of marijuana activism from about 1964, the first pro-legalization protest which took place in San Francisco, to today, where we see 8 states in Washington, D.C., kind of 9 with Vermont, maybe 10 with New Jersey, legalizing recreational cannabis use, and a larger, more growing embrace of industrial hemp growing as well after the 2014 Farm Bill that Doug had up on one of his slides. So there are sort of 3 main trajectories that marijuana activism went on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that to kind of set the table for how we can talk about hemp activism as well, which is what I know a little bit more about. So the 3 main movements were a pro-legalization or pro-decriminalization movement in the 1960s and 70s, which birthed a counter-revolution, the Parent Movement, which was the bulk of my dissertation, which pushed very anti-marijuana laws or prohibitive tendencies, which the Reagan administration really picked up on. And then ultimately out of that came a new legalization movement which pushed for medical marijuana in 29 states in DC and now recreational marijuana use in 9 in DC. So to go a little bit more into that, this push and pull, this pendulum swinging back and forth, is really fascinating or at least it was to me when I was writing this book, because for the most part, when we think of laws, particularly those surrounding intoxicating drugs or psychoactive drugs, we think of them as pronouncements from above, right? It's, Reagan who's coming down and saying, we are going to launch the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which is going to put those mandatory minimum sentences on the books, and, things are going to get very bad. Or it's Nancy Reagan promoting just say no to whatever effects that had. Or it's Jimmy Carter saying, I'm going to let decriminalization laws stand. Or it's, Bill Clinton saying he didn't inhale, things like that. But marijuana laws have never changed in the United States because like a major leader, like a president or a state councilman or anything like that, acted first. It was only ever because of grassroots activists, because of average Americans who realized that there was something about this substance in particular, about cannabis, that really provoked them to take to the streets, whether they were for or against the use of the drug. So in the 1960s, when the first legalization protests took place and spread quite rapidly across the United States, it spread because cannabis activism related so closely and intrinsically with these larger ideas about, what was really driving the youth movement of the 60s. There was a questioning of what truth was, particularly if it was coming from the federal government. People who were protesting for the legalization of cannabis or for the decriminalization of it argued that they had been told for so long that marijuana was very similar to Reefer Madness, 1936 film, that it would lead immediately to madness, to murder, to miscegenation, to suicide, to all these horrible things. And as the drug was growing in use and kind of spreading across the United States from college campuses outward, people realized that wasn't necessarily true. So they began questioning the legality of these laws. And that was combined very much into larger protests. They were questioning what the federal government was doing in things like the Vietnam War or the necessity of segregation, the fight for civil rights and things like that. So in 1970, when Nixon's trying to pass the Controlled Substances Act, which developed the 5 schedules for drugs, 1 through 5, 1 being the most restricted and 5 being kind of aspirin and cough syrup and things like that, Nixon was obviously very vehemently opposed to marijuana and really wanted to push marijuana's placement into Schedule 1. So he convened a commission, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission, after its leader, Raymond Schaefer, the former governor of Pennsylvania, and said, study this for 2 years. And what he was really hoping for would be connections between marijuana and all of the deviant behavior that he saw happening at the time. The people protesting in the streets and all those crazy youth with their crazy ideas. The Schaefer Commission finds no connection between these two things whatsoever. After 2 years, they released this report, which is published widely as a paperback for like $1.25, and they say marijuana users are no different than the average American. Drug laws are far more harmful than good because they make young people distrustful of the police and things like that. And ultimately, they recommended national decriminalization, not legalization, but decriminalization. Nixon's furious. He ignores the entire report and says, not a chance. But states start to pick up on it. And between 1973 and 1978, a dozen states containing about 1/3 of the nation's population decriminalized the personal possession of marijuana. So this is the first time since really the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act that all of a sudden marijuana was somewhat available. It was now like a civil fine. Some places were more heavily fined than others, but for the most part it was available. And the reason decriminalization laws passed in state legislatures is because the use of the drug was being defended as an adult's right to privacy. If an adult was doing this in the privacy of their own home and not hurting anyone else, what was the point of locking them up? What was the point of locking up a college student or a tax-paying, citizen or whatever? So marijuana users were very much painted as responsible, respectable citizens. Of course, this changes in the 1970s and 80s as the parent movement rises up to power because they realized that ultimately decriminalization allowed for drug use to trickle down. It's really the only time trickle-down economics have ever worked, right? So all of a sudden, young people are accessing the drug because decriminalization doesn't have levels of oversight or regulation that legalization does. It's simply two different animals, right? So children started using the drug really in fairly astronomical numbers, and parents were very upset about that because, again, the only information about marijuana use was coming from the federal government, and they had reports saying that pot would cause young boys to grow breasts, it would render young girls infertile, it was going to destroy generations of Americans, a motivational syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. They're terrified of this. So they start gathering together in these little groups, ultimately like consciousness-raising groups, if you can remember the term from second wave feminism, saying we're not going to allow this into our community, we're not going to allow this into our households. Once the kids reach 18, they're allowed to do what they want, but while you're a kid in my house, you can't do these drugs. Nancy Reagan becomes First Lady in 1980. She's incredibly unpopular, and she needs a platform that would make her seem more loving and warm and maternal, and the prevention of adolescent drug abuse is her ticket to ride, right? So she takes the parent movement's platform and runs with it, and turns it into this very prohibitive, uniform, just say no, all drugs are bad, all drugs will kill you, platform that we remember her for best today. And it doesn't work that well, right? But it changes the conversation around marijuana in this country, away from an adult's right to do something in the privacy of their own home to the right of a child to grow up drug-free, which paints any drug-using adult as a threat to that child and therefore a criminal who deserves to be locked up and incarcerated, which we did to millions of people for the possession of cannabis over the past 30, 40 years. But this changes again, because in the 1980s, we also have the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And one of the few substances that would really help a lot of the people who are suffering from HIV/AIDS in the 80s before we understood what the disease really was marijuana, was cannabis. It would give them back an appetite, it would calm the nausea, it would give them a little bit of strength, a little bit of levity, right? So marijuana gets tied to the HIV/AIDS epidemic and becomes not this destructive, demonized drug that's going to kill an entire generation of children, but a potential panacea. And through that, we get the first medical marijuana law in 1996 in California, which have spread now nationwide. And this idea of justice, of marijuana being a potential substance that could be used to achieve social justice continues. This conversation continues to today, where in 2012 we saw the first legalization laws passed in Colorado and Washington. Again, those laws were passed almost entirely not as any kind of economic argument, but as a social justice argument. Because for the most part, although all the races use marijuana, or at least blacks and whites use marijuana in relatively equal numbers, African Americans are up to 4 times more likely to be arrested for the substance than whites. So although no one, I think, can argue that legalization will eradicate America's racist history or the racist proclivities of cops, it's a one concrete step that some people feel we can take to make America live up to its creed as, the land of the free and equal and things like that. So social justice is this major driver for recreational cannabis. But as Doug was saying, hemp is very different. I did a little bit of hemp research while I was working on this book, and it would always kind of pop up like, oh yeah, and then there's these hemp activists over here, like, aren't they interesting? And it's always been very different, because whereas people were advocating for marijuana for privacy or for medicine or for social justice, hemp has these ties to the environment, to agriculture, to health. I was just in Denver and I picked up this thing for Colorado hemp honey healing infusions. You can give it to your pet. It's kind of awesome, right? So it's tied to health, it's tied to agriculture, it's tied to rural communities, it's tied to economics, it's tied to global markets. And recreational cannabis doesn't quite have those same ties because of the restrictions placed on it, right? Pot grown in California must be consumed in California. Must be. But anyway, because there is no difference, no biological difference between hemp and cannabis or marijuana, many prohibitionists still fear this entire program, right? Because they see it as a Trojan horse. Well, if we allow hemp to be cultivated, who knows what's going to happen to the flowers or the leaves or all these other things. They're very scared that this is just opening a door to wider cultivation of the psychoactive drug. So laws are also still very strange, right? Doug was talking a little bit about that. And even states that have legalized recreational marijuana have different laws for hemp. And one of his slides up there was talking about the 2014 Farm Bill, right, which allowed for some states to begin researching hemp, growing hemp, and things like that, which is why we have the program here now at UVA, which is up for it's up for debate again in 2018, right? I think the Farm Bill comes up every 4 years or so. And if you read reports from the Congressional Research Service, which I did, I read like 7 of them before this panel, they're all very dry. I don't recommend it. But there's a ton of questions that still need to be asked. I mean, there's just no clarification on who can grow or cultivate hemp. They need clarity on USDA research support for hemp, clarity on the very definition of industrial hemp, clarity on restrictions on sale, transportation, commerce, all this other stuff. There's still a lot of questions about this. So there's a lot of confusion and a lack of clarity around the field as a whole. But for activists, which are the people that I study and those who kind of have interest me research-wise the most, what's interesting to me is that there's always this one little group that's so into hemp. They're so excited about it, and they're some of the most well-educated activists in the field, because they recognize that hemp is something that is larger than a simple psychoactive substance. It's obviously tied to global trade. It's tied to developments that we can potentially make in the realm of industry, in transportation, in biofuels, and all this other stuff. But the U.S. has a history of not really embracing it, right? Like we're sort of, most hemp activists, or most cannabis activists, I should say, are maybe shooting themselves in the foot by not embracing it as much. And indeed, the United States might be shooting itself in the foot by not embracing it as well. China is the global leader in hemp growing and cultivation, and Canada is the North American leader. So we're already quite, behind the times a little bit. So where do we go from here, right? That's always the question I ask when you write the history of activism. It's pretty much the first one I always get asked as well. So what do we do now, right? And I think hemp is really good for activists. I think hemp is a realm that activists who are really supportive of recreational use as well should begin to really embrace and hold on to. Because we know scientifically the benefits of this plant, of everything that it can do, and the myriad things that it has to offer, a variety of fields. Particularly, as Doug was saying, for a world and an environment and a marketplace that's trying to heal itself, that's trying to promote more sustainable practices, that's trying to promote more sustainable products. There's a lot of benefits to this. And if it's a Trojan horse, well, I think a lot of activists would say, saddle up, right? It's not a bad idea. The momentum is here as legalization has a lot of support behind it, both from the social justice and an economics point of view. Because a new prohibition movement is forming. They're very quiet right now. They don't have a lot of public support, but the pendulum on America's opinion on cannabis, on marijuana, on hemp, is always moving. It's always swinging back and forth. It never stays in one place. So the bigger problem may be the impending commercialization of the market. It may be America's overturning of these legalization laws that have been passed in various states. It could be a number of different things. But at least as far as my research has kind of found, I think hemp would be a really excellent place for activism to begin to move into, because as Doug is showing, there's a lot of potential for it, and there's just the embrace of it should. We're probably about 50, 60 years too late, but you know what? It's okay. We have time to make up. And that's my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Doug. And I'd like to now open up questions by the audience. We already have a taker, so if we can get the gentleman down in front, a microphone.
But 2 quick questions. One is, I live in Virginia. My state senator has just finally gotten cannabinoid oils approved for medicinal use. This is a cause he's been pushing for 5 or 6 years. He knows somebody, I think somebody who was a constituent of his, had to go to Colorado with her daughter because she had intractable epilepsy. And the oil is a great remedy for that. And so it's just appalling that there's such resistance to something that's not psychoactive and medically valid, and yet I guess that's part of the Trojan horse. They're just afraid that if they allow that, then who knows what it will lead to. The other question is, though, related to using marijuana privately. There's the whole problem of driving while impaired. And that is a real issue as people get out in cars. It's a problem with alcohol. It's probably going to continue to be a problem with the marijuana. And so that's just a real issue that really can't be dismissed as, oh, well, everybody's using it in private, because some of them are out in public doing things they shouldn't do.
Emily, would you like to take a stab at that?
That would be great. Yeah, I think your first point about that resistance to the oils and things like that is well taken. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania just started selling some medical cannabis as well. And again, they at first only allowed oils, salves, things like that, like topical ointments and things like that. But because it's sold out immediately, they now do allow for flowers and buds and things like that. But again, it was pushed through a very tight legislature, because for the most part, all powerful and provocative and ultimately successful arguments for or against the passage of marijuana laws have been surrounded by, or have been centered on, the most sympathetic face possible. And in Pennsylvania, when the first medical dispensary opened in Bethlehem, which was like next door to where I grew up, there was a guy who had gotten into a very bad car accident. He was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He was constantly in pain. His spine was very badly damaged. He got in line at 4 a.m. for the dispensary to open at 10. And as soon as the dispensary opened, he went in and bought $500 worth of oil, salves, and things like that. And he had to pay out of pocket because, health insurance doesn't cover things like that. So the coverage of Pennsylvania's first medical dispensary was hugely sympathetic to this poor guy who doesn't want to go on opioids because he doesn't want to get addicted and go down that path. He wants to use this substance, which is natural, which is holistic, which is in many places organic and things like that. He has to pay for it out of pocket. He said that $500 stash would only last him about a month. And that was the face of medical marijuana. So when that's the face of medical cannabis, it's very hard to say, no, you're not allowed to have this because it's a Trojan horse and all these awful things are going to happen. So Pennsylvania is actually very supportive of it. But your other point about, impaired drivers or, can the drug be abused and things like that, you don't just use it in the privacy of your home, your own home. Oftentimes you leave your home, right? We're not all hermits, right? That's a very substantial question, and no one has quite figured out how to answer it yet. I would say that as legalization laws pass, each one does seem to build more substantially upon the last. California is doing a lot to work on, figuring out how to, expunge people's prior records and do all this other sort of good stuff, but figure out how to control it, how to live with it in the environment. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Maybe just one or two quickies.
Sure.
Thanks for that, by the way. Thanks for the questions. First off, I don't believe that there is a Trojan horse at all. I think that when we're looking at, just look at Colorado, their governor Hickenlooper opposed the legalization initiative that passed in 2012 and has done nothing but mea culpas publicly for the last year or two. It's the lowest unemployment in the nation, reduced domestic violence, reduced traffic issues because people are substituting cannabis for alcohol. For my own kids, when they become driving age, I'm going to teach them that complete sobriety is the key. And that said, multiple studies, look them up, double blind, the whole deal, established institutions have shown, especially amongst people that are experienced with cannabis, negligible decline in driving ability, reaction time. I believe that this focus on intoxicated driving vis-a-vis cannabis is a red herring, and it is what I consider to be unconscionable drug warriors mining the harbor in their retreat from losing, deservedly, America's worst policy since segregation, which is cannabis prohibition. Turned us into the most incarcerated nation in history, and it's the same people that are advocating for so-called intoxicated driving issues that are behind profiting from private prisons, drug testing, and all that business. That's also documented. This is not just an activist making up stuff. We can look this up. All of that said, we need to reevaluate how we handle sober driving. I want sober driving on the roads when my kids are driving around, and ask any cop that deals with it, and cannabis is about 27th on his or her list. When you've got to worry about intoxicated driving, it's this cocktail of pharmaceuticals that people are on, combined with alcohol, that is the real problem. And cannabis is way down the list. The other thing that has to change is the way that testing is done. It has to be an objective testing of people's ability to drive on the road, because cannabis registers in your bloodstream for up to a month or more, and therefore is not a measure. You can't have per se THC limits as your regulatory framework, because 0.02% THC in the blood is going to affect person A very differently from person D. It has to be, are you whacked out on legal pharmaceuticals? Are you drunk? Is the cannabis affecting you or not? And as Emily said, it's not been established. We really have to address this as a nation, but I do believe that the focus on cannabis is a misdirection.
Thank you. Other questions? 1, 2, 3. Let's try to keep our answers short.
Yes.
Hi. So my question was in regard to the testing that California and the other states are adopting now, and Virginia adopted from the get-go. That isn't going to ever go away, you know, the quality control that the states are trying to implement now for CBD products or THC, whatever it is, really high. And how do states, farmers manage that kind of scenario in the future? It's focused down to the quality of the highest degree, and most people can't get there without a lot of money or indoors. And you know, you guys talk about that, but how are people actually going to tangibly reach the goal of providing that stuff you're talking about?
Give a short answer to that one.
Yeah.
My belief in the end game, the legislative end game for cannabis is that THC levels, any cannabinoid levels, but THC being the only known psychoactive component, that THC levels will be irrelevant until and unless a final product is leaving a facility for public consumption, and a regional locality will regulate if it is over, if it meets or is above a certain threshold of psychoactivity, will be regulated for adult use like alcohol or tobacco is. And I've been speaking to top lobbyists about this, and we're all on the same page. This is the end game. So the laws that you see now are not here forever.
And just really quick, I think, you know, testing, licenses, all of this stuff, it is ludicrously expensive, and in that way it is very selective on who can afford, you know. In California, after 2021, it's going to be $125,000 a year to afford, you know, a legal licensing fee. So in that case, yeah, it's obviously kind of more supportive of those who can afford these things. So is it going to be the rich people who are just going to get richer off of a drug that's newly been legalized? There's a lot of activism and arguments for expanding who can enter into this industry, and no one has quite figured out how to make it less or more welcoming, I should say, to farmers who are coming in at any level. It's a huge problem and a huge question. Yeah.
Woman in the green now.
Hi. Does anybody know what the current status is in Virginia? Somebody in the room? I don't.
The current status of what?
Of hemp or cannabis, whichever way you want to describe it. Is it just totally illegal? Are there any movements to not? To at least decriminalizing? I don't know what it is.
The status is that under the Farm Bill you can legally grow industrial hemp, which is the non-psychoactive form of cannabis, for research purposes, and then this coming year, June or July, a new law will come into effect where in the past it had been only open up for experimental research, but it'll be open up for all farmers who want to grow under a set grower's license. The pharmaceutical law that is currently pending and is waiting to be signed by the governor opens up the manufacture and distribution of cannabinoid-based pharmaceuticals for use under basically a doctor's prescription. And so we're waiting for that to pass. But we are not a full legalized state compared to, say, Colorado or California. If you want to, at the end of the program, you might talk to Jason Amatucci, who's one of our sponsors, who can provide you with a clear and extensive recounting of exactly where we are on the wall. The woman in red?
I've got several things. One, I was actually a pretty heavy prosecutor in New Mexico. Okay, that being said, I prosecuted Truth and Consequences, Ruidoso, and Alamogordo. That being said, I have never prosecuted anyone for driving under the influence of cannabis. For other prescription drugs, anything else, and New Mexico is a medical marijuana state. The other thing I want to say is I am interested. My son owns 2 farms in Augusta County, and we were talking about him possibly growing hemp on a piece of his property, and I'm also very interested in growing hemp. I've always been intrigued and frustrated about the situation. How can we get involved?
I think Professor Timko handled that in a good way, and besides, Jason really is very politically connected and can tell you, but I'm just learning from him that there is a bill on the horizon for farmers to be able to apply for a permit that would in turn make you federally compliant with the Farm Bill provision. In order to be Farm Bill compliant, you have to have a permittee in your state's hemp program, and that is imminent in Virginia. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, join the Virginia Industrial Hemp Coalition and keep an eye on the progress.
Yeah, there's farmers here that you can talk with that are in the program as well. But I would say recommend you to kind of join our coalition, because that's what it's all about, is networking, and you start to learn from people. And it's not an easy process. It's a learning curve, and it's a lot of information, a lot of regulation. But yeah, I would say the first step is to sort of join a coalition like ourselves.
Questions for our author?
So this is the festival of the book, so let's talk a little bit about the books that you guys have. Exactly what's your theme of each one that you have out here?
Well, I only have one book, so I'm nothing compared to him. So my book is the history of marijuana activism. It's funny, so this week also marks the 15th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, the beginning of the Iraq War. That may not seem connected to what we're talking about here, but it actually is connected to my book. In 2003, I remember taking a bus down from New York, where I was living at the time. I was doing my undergrad at NYU, to protest the war, to protest the invasion. And I'm walking around the National Mall, and I see people wearing tie-dye and drum circles and everything. And I remember thinking, that's cool. But it didn't work in the 1960s to protest Vietnam, and I don't know if it's going to work today. 15 years later, we're still in Iraq. So I became really intrigued by activism. And I wanted to study it because I wanted to understand how to increase its efficacy. How does grassroots activism work? How does it become powerful? And how does it change laws? How does it change anything, right? So when I got to grad school, I started in 2008, I finished my classwork, I did my comprehensive exams, and in 2010 I was searching around for a thesis, a dissertation topic. And I was really interested in drug history. I had started reading Martin Torgoff's book, Can't Find My Way Home, a couple of years ago, which is an awesome drug history of the late 20th century. And I noticed that he had mentioned the parent movement in 1 or 2 sentences, but didn't really go deep into it. And the more I thought, wait a second, they influenced everything. I was a DARE graduate in elementary school. I vaguely remember Just Say No, this sort of miasma of cultural influence. I thought, wait a second, this movement's responsible for that. It's worth kind of figuring out what's going on. And the parent movement, whether or not you agree with their stance, I think anyone who has children can agree that you don't want your children to be harmed, right? You don't want them to do things that are going to harm themselves or to be harmed by others. Whether or not you agree with them, they were incredibly powerful activists, so prolific and so influential. So I started writing about them for the dissertation, and then I realized, well, the parent movement did not exist in a vacuum. They formed as a counter-revolution to this movement for decriminalization in the 60s and 70s. And their actions, formed the rebirth of a legalization movement in the 80s, 90s, and today. So this constantly like swinging pendulum, this moving tide of activism surrounding this one substance, this one drug that inspires so many people. That was what really I was just like, wow, that's really cool. So I wrote the book, or I wrote the dissertation about that 2 years before the first legalization laws passed. So I don't know how I lucked out, like writing about a topic that all of a sudden became a big national thing, but I'm psyched. It was great. So that's essentially my book. I write about the history of the activism surrounding legalization and criminalization, and at the end I kind of summarize the lessons learned from 4 decades of activism to hopefully be useful for activists of the future, which are, regardless of whichever side they're on. To the more prolific author.
Just been at it a little bit longer. Next time we meet, it'll be a closer number. Real quick, Farewell My Subaru. I was worried about climate change, and I wanted to see if there was an impact that an individual could have. It's a humorous, self-deprecating account of what it's like for one guy to try to give up fossil fuels but keep digital age comforts. The goats are still outsmarting me. I'm still nearly electrocuting myself with the solar panels. Read all about it. How to Fail. I embedded with organic style cooperative farmers in what's widely regarded as the highest quality cannabis cultivation region, which is the Emerald Triangle, starting in just north of the Bay Area, almost to Cascadia on the Canadian border. And this was in Mendocino County, and told the story of de facto legalization, how it was working, the revenues provided, pros and cons. That's Too High to Fail. It was while those farmers were trying to work on collaborative and collective processing of the plant that they brought to my attention that not much was being done with the fiber on the cannabis side, basically being composted or chopped or whatever. And so that started me researching hemp. It took me all over the world, from Canada, Slovenia, all over. And the resulting Hemp Bound is basically an examination of what you can do with the 3 parts of the plant's architecture: the fiber, the seed, and the flower. To keep it real brief of things I haven't mentioned yet, this is a superfood. This is the seeds that are dehulled. You can eat the whole seeds. You can press it into oil. The protein that is the byproduct of the oil pressing is also super healthy. Incredibly high protein, incredibly high minerals. Yeah, I eat it every day. This is my road food. This herd, which is the inner core of is a big growing market into what's generally shorthanded as hempcrete, and my sons and I made this in about 2 minutes. It's solid. I mean, you can't squeeze it. It's a carbon negative building material, worth researching more. And then what happened was Hemp Bound, also lucky timing, Hemp Bound came out right when the Farm Bill was passed, and I immediately wanted to write a follow-up book. Chelsea Green, the terrific publishers of Hemp Bound, said, "You just published this one. Give us a couple years." And they actually kept their word. We're now entering a contract for a follow-up, which is going to be a more practical how-to. How do you plant it? What all the different steps? How do you process? How do you brand it? And all that. That's a book I'm working on now. But I couldn't wait. So again, my partners and good friends at Colorado Hemp Company, the same folks who do this hemp-printed Declaration of Independence on my hemp-printed business card. Out front there, you'll see First Legal Harvest. It's a hemp-printed book from some of the first legal harvest after the Farm Bill. American hemp, very small amount of American hemp, mostly imported hemp in this initial printing. But it tells the story of those first farmers to get those first permits in 3 different states, including Edgar and Margaret here. And that's all of it.
If I may. Thank you, and thank you for coming. I've been lobbying for a hemp panel for years as a bookseller. Just very briefly, if you're looking at books, there are a couple other things I brought. I basically sell cannabis books all over the United States, carry about 130 titles. There's 5 signed books there, and also if anybody's interested in Rick Simpson's book, who lives in Croatia now, I'm the only distributor for signed copies in North America. So ask me if you have an interest.
Thank you.